4 days. That's all the time it took for Germany to successfully invade and occupy the Netherlands in the Second World War. The Germans invaded their Dutch neighbors on May 10, 1940, and by the 14th it was all over. The Dutch were clearly unprepared for the might of Hitler. Although a government in exile was able to establish itself in London under Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, she and her cabinet in exile would remain there until the end of the war. But what happened to the Royal Dutch Navy during the war? After all, this was a country with a proud naval history going back to the 17th century and the Dutch golden age of naval prowess. By 1939, the Navy was acknowledged as being the strongest of the country's military branches. As we'll see, the Free Dutch Navy, as it was known, would be intricately linked with the country's colonies in the East. By the late 1930s, the Dutch Navy was a minor one by European standards. She had a relatively small, although still quite impressive fleet consisting of 11 destroyers, 5 cruisers, 2 training cruisers, 4 coastal defense ships, 11 torpedo boats, 5 armored gunboats, and a modern sloop. Her navy also boasted 30 submarines, as well as a large fleet of minelayers and minesweepers. However, most of her fleet was based in what was then the pearl of the Dutch Empire, namely the Dutch East Indies, which is today Indonesia. The East Indies would play the most significant role in the Royal Dutch Navy's progression through World War II, as we shall see. Unlike other, larger and more major European powers such as France and Germany, the Netherlands had not been curtailed by any impositions put on it after the First World War. Instead, the Dutch Navy languished until 1938 due to a lack of funds and not much interest by the Dutch government of the day, even as its possessions in Asia remained vulnerable to fast-growing Japanese imperialist designs. It was only in 1938, just a year or so before the outbreak of another world war, that the Dutch government made plans to build 3 battlecruisers. This was largely in response to the ever-growing antagonism in Eastern and Southeast Asia by the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN. This included increasing evidence that Japan wanted to invade the Dutch East Indies and the island of Java in particular. The Dutch battlecruisers would have been more than a match for any existing Japanese cruiser. There was also a reason why the Dutch made the interesting decision to invest so heavily in submarines in the interwar years, far more so than other navies of comparable size. In short, submarines were easier and cheaper to build than cruisers or destroyers, and far easier to maintain too. They could also travel long distances, making them ideal for overseas deployments. The Netherlands had been actively using submarines dating back to 1905. Even with the emphasis on subs, the Dutch had still invested in some modern light cruisers, such as the HNLMS Ruyter, and 2 new classes of destroyers known as the Admiral class and Tromp classes. The principal purpose of these vessels was to protect her East Indies colonies, as well as offer support to the Navy's fleet of submarines. Unsurprisingly, the Dutch Navy could never be a match for the might of Germany's Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, or Navy and Air Force, respectively. German strikes destroyed 7 Dutch vessels during the invasion, including the destroyer Van Galen, the destroyer escort Christian Cornelis, the gunboats Johann Moritz and Friso, the mine-laying vessels Hydra and Bulgia, and the minesweeper M3. 5 Dutch vessels still under construction were captured by the Germans, of which 3 heavy destroyers went into service for the Kriegsmarine. These were the Tjurk Hiddes, Gerard Kallenberg, and Philips van Almond. The Germans were further able to capture a number of lesser Dutch vessels, many of them already obsolete, including a torpedo workship, a mine-laying vessel, 2 obsolete submarines, 2 obsolete coastal gunboats, and 3 obsolete gunboats. The Germans also nabbed 3 submarines under construction, the O-25, O-26, and O-27, as well as 6 minesweepers being built, all of which went into commission with the Kriegsmarine. A tanker and 10 motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, all under construction, were also seized and commissioned by Germany's Navy. The MTBs would all go on to serve as German E-booty, or E-boats, in the Mediterranean. The Kriegsmarine also recovered the minesweepers MI, MII, and MIV after Dutch crews had attempted to scuttle the three vessels. A few other minor vessels, some of them already obsolete, were also scuttled by the Dutch. However, what is surprising is the number of Dutch vessels that still managed to escape to England. Those that escaped included the light cruiser Sumatra, the modern gunboats Flores and Gruno, the minesweeper John van Gelder, and no less than 5 mine-laying ships. The Dutch submarines 09, 010, and 013 also managed to escape to Britain. Even a few Dutch ships that were still under construction but already afloat were able to escape to England, including the heavy destroyer Isaac Sweers, the light cruiser Jacob van Heemskerk, and the submarines 021, 022, 023, and 024. All remaining Dutch naval vessels during the invasion were either out in the Dutch East Indies or safely in Allied ports around Europe. It's to Southeast Asia that we need to focus. One thing needs to be clear. The Royal Dutch Navy could never dream of being a match for the might of the formidable Japanese Navy, or IJN. For Dutch naval defenses to be effective, the Netherlands had to rely on its alliance with the greater size and might of Britain's Royal Navy, which had its base in Singapore. The main focus of Dutch defenses and offenses in the East Indies would be with its fleet of submarines. By the way, as we saw, all the submarines that were either seized or escaped during the German invasion were designated with an O. The O stood for Onderzeeboot, or home boats, meaning they were based in the Netherlands. A few of these did go out to join their counterparts in the East Indies. Submarines that operated overseas were designated with a K, which stood for colonial. Not surprisingly, the colonial submarines were larger and had a longer operating range. They were also better ventilated and had stronger gun armaments than their home-based counterparts. Interestingly, Dutch submarine crews in the East Indies also consisted of Indonesian natives who were forced to berth and mess in separate quarters to their white Dutch shipmates. The more modern Dutch submarines in the colonial fleet consisted mainly of 2 classes. The first was the KX-4 class, which was 242 feet or 73.7 meters in length, with a surface displacement of 771 tons. The second was the slightly larger 019 class, which was 265 feet or 80.7 meters in length, and a surface displacement of 998 tons. Both Dutch classes of submarines had 6 internal torpedo tubes, with 4 forward and 2 aft. They also had a pair of trainable deck tubes in their superstructures. Deck armaments included a 3.4-inch gun and 2 40mm guns in disappearing mounts. They could carry up to 40 mines, something that was particularly useful in the shallows of the thousands of islands in the East Indies. There were 15 Dutch submarines in the Far East, all except 4 of which were conflict-ready. When the Japanese attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Dutch were already poised to assist. On that very same day, the members of the so-called ABDA Command, or American, British, Dutch, and Australian Alliance, declared war on Imperial Japan. 7 Dutch submarines were positioned and ready in the Gulf of Siam off the coast of Thailand and in the South China Sea in order to intercept any Japanese invasion convoys heading for Dutch or British colonies in the East Indies. 4 more Dutch submarines were deployed a few days later, with the remaining 4 in active service standing by in reserve. Dutch submarines outnumbered those of the Royal Navy, with only 2 British submarines patrolling the waters off the East Indies in December 1941. In just 2 weeks between December 12 and 25, 1941, Dutch subs were able to sink or badly damage between 10 and 12 Japanese vessels. Unfortunately for the Dutch, they lost 4 submarines in that period. These were the O-16, lost to a Japanese mine on December 15th, the K-Isunim to a mine or Japanese depth charges at around the same time, the O-20 to gunfire from the Japanese destroyer Uranami on the 19th, and the KXVI to torpedo fire from the Japanese submarine I-66 on Christmas Day. On December 21st, a 5th Dutch submarine, the Kzil, suffered serious damage due to a battery explosion when in Singapore. She was towed to Surabaya on the island of Java in the Dutch East Indies for repairs but never went back into active service. However, by early 1942, Japanese naval advances in Southeast Asia and the East Indies were relentless. The Allied submarines couldn't do anything about beating the Japanese, and it all came to a head in the so-called Battle of the Java Sea. On that day, February 27, 1942, the Dutch High Commander Admiral Karel Doorman and 150 of his sailors went down with his fleet. During that fierce battle, in which numerous American and Australian vessels also took part, the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Java were both hit by Japanese torpedoes, with the latter sinking especially quickly. The De Ruyter would remain at the surface for some time, but eventually sank as well, taking Admiral Doorman down with it. The surface vessel Free Dutch Navy in Asia was virtually wiped out. Even the British couldn't cope with the Japanese onslaught, with Singapore being lost to the Japanese, and so the Dutch submarines retreated to Surabaya. However, not only had most of the Dutch submarines suffered damage during their excursions at sea, but the base at Surabaya was under incessant and vicious Japanese aerial attacks. It went from bad to worse, and in little time the Dutch lost control of Java to the Japanese. The Allied subs had to retreat, and so 4 of the remaining Dutch boats, along with a couple of British subs, withdrew to the British base at Colombo in Ceylon, which today is Sri Lanka. The Dutch boats needed extensive refitting and suffered from a lack of spare parts. Of the 4, O-19 made 2 patrols out of Colombo, then headed to Scotland for a much-needed refit. KXV undertook 1 patrol to western Sumatra in the East Indies before heading for the United States for an extensive refit at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. KXI was also sent to the same yard in the U.S. for a refit. Both those subs would later return to the Far East. The older KXI made 2 patrols in the Indian Ocean before being sent to the port of Fremantle in Australia to take up a new role as an anti-submarine trainer. It would be phased out in 1944. Most of the remaining operations by the Royal Dutch Navy were based principally out of Fremantle, Australia, under the command of the U.S. Commander, Submarine Southwest Pacific Division of the United States Navy. These Fremantle-based submarines did have some successes, including the sinking of the German U-boat U-168 in the Java Sea, the result of 6 torpedoes being launched at the German sub. Japanese vessels that were sunk or heavily damaged by the Dutch, although exact numbers are not clear, included a cruiser, 3 mine layers, and either 2 or 3 naval auxiliaries, as well as either 3 or 4 small merchant ships, and either 19 or 20 junks or coasters. The Dutch submarines were also involved in the transporting of Allied spies to and from Japanese-occupied islands. The Dutch were not only active in the Far East, however. The Free Dutch Navy had naval units that transported troops, for example during Operation Dynamo at Dunkirk and on D-Day as well. In November 1941, the U-boat U-95 was sunk in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Almeria in Spain by the Dutch submarine O-21. You may be wondering about what happened to the Dutch West Indies in the Caribbean, which consisted of the islands of Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, Saba, and Saint Eustatius, and Saint Martin, as well as Suriname in South America. All of them were defended by the British and Americans, mostly to defend the oil refineries in Aruba and Curaçao, which were the largest in the world at the time. The Dutch left these defenses to other countries because they had just 1 naval vessel stationed in the entire region, the sloop Van Kinsbergen. In all, the Free Dutch Navy lost 2,500 sailors and 20 ships in its campaign on the side of the Allies in the Far East. As for their submarines, the Dutch lost 136 crew members and were able to undertake 84 patrols in total, including 28 before having to evacuate their base in Surabaya, 29 from their second base in Ceylon, and 27 from their final base in Australia. It was in the Far East arena that the Dutch were made famous for their unrelenting bravery and their impressive hit rate when compared to the far larger British and American naval fleets. It was a worthy addition to a navy with a long and proud tradition.